Good evening and welcome, friends, from wherever in the world you may be joining us. My name is David Weisberg, and I'm honored to serve as the Executive Director of World Jewish Relief USA. And I'm, in fact, joining you today from Tbilisi, Georgia, which is why I said good evening. It's evening here. I know for some of you it's good afternoon. I'm here in Tbilisi, Georgia, where I've been visiting World Jewish Relief's programs and meeting some of the people whose lives are being touched by our work. There's a particular resonance in hosting today's conversation from here. In 2002, Tbilisi experienced a damaging earthquake that killed and injured residents and damaged thousands of buildings. And more than 2 decades later, there are still reminders of that earthquake that are visible in parts of this city. It's a really powerful reminder that while an earthquake might last only seconds, its impact can often be felt for years. Of course, the work that I've come to Georgia to witness is very different from the emergency response now underway in Venezuela. Much of our work here supports older adults and others facing vulnerability and isolation. Elsewhere, our work takes other forms, responding to urgent humanitarian needs, such as a cholera outbreak in Mozambique or the war in Ukraine, supporting farmers building sustainable livelihoods in Uganda, and working alongside communities facing crisis and poverty in many other parts of the world. That breadth is important. When a disaster like the earthquakes in Venezuela occurs, World Jewish Relief must be able to respond with urgency. But a new emergency doesn't mean that the existing crises that we're serving are any less urgent, nor does it diminish our commitment to the people and communities with whom we're already working. Our response in Venezuela expands the work we're doing, but it doesn't replace it. And that is part of what we want to explore today. How World Jewish Relief makes the decision to respond to a new emergency, how we determine where we can make the greatest impact, how we identify and work with trusted local partners, and how we think beyond the immediate emergency to the weeks and months and indeed even years to follow. I want to introduce the 2 amazing staff people, my colleagues from World Jewish Relief, who are joining us for this webinar. Our Director of International Programs and Partnerships, Stacey Swimer, who's joining us from London, and our Director of Humanitarian Programs, James Silverman, who is joining us from Caracas, Venezuela. Just a little bit about the format for today. James and Stacey will be in conversation for the first maybe 40 minutes of the program, and then we're going to reserve the last 20 minutes for questions and answers from our attendees. Please feel free at any time to put your questions into the question and answer function. We do have some photographs that James has been taking in Caracas that we'll be sharing during the webinar, but in a situation like this, there's not the time or ability to choreograph a webinar like this so that every photograph is going to perfectly align with what James and Stacey are going to talk about, but we still want to give you a visual feel for what James is experiencing in Caracas and indeed what the community is experiencing down there as well. I also just want to note the reality that James is in Caracas, I'm in Tbilisi, Stacey is in London, where there's probably the most reliable internet connection of the 3 of us. But hopefully this is going to run smoothly. None of us are going to get booted. But what we've found in the post-COVID Zoom world is that there's this level playing field where those things happen. And so we pray, among other things, that our internet connections remain smooth for the presentation of our program tonight. And with that, I want to begin the conversation, and I want to turn to Stacey, our Director of International Programs and Partnerships. And I want to ask Stacey, before we hear from James about what we're seeing on the ground, take us back to the beginning. When news of the earthquakes first emerged, how did World Jewish Relief determined that we had a meaningful role to play there, and how quickly did that decision to respond happen?
Thanks, David, and it's great to be here tonight. And I'd love to say that my internet connection is totally stable here in London, but you never know what's going to happen. So hopefully it will go all right, though. I think, your question, it has two parts to it, really. And the first question is thinking about how we decide to respond to a humanitarian emergency, because we can't respond to all disasters everywhere. But what we try and do is really make a rapid but robust assessment with the help of a set criteria. And we do that by bringing together different team members across the organisation to evaluate and assess different aspects. So firstly, we want to evaluate the scale and the severity of the humanitarian need, and whether those needs are already being met by others, and whether we think World Rush Relief would be able to raise the necessary funds to add value to the response. So that's really important part. We then also look beyond that, and we really try and consider whether we have an existing or credible local partner, or how feasible it would be to find one. Whether we might want someone like James to go out and be there in the field, and if that would even be possible, what type of assistance is most appropriate, and whether we have suitable funding. As humanitarians, we care about and we want to respond to all disasters, but we recognise that caring is not enough in itself. We need the confidence that we can act quickly, safely, accountably, without duplicating others. And of course, that we can raise the money to meaningfully respond as well. So that can lead to different outcomes and decisions. So firstly, it can lead to an appeal like we have done for Venezuela. Or it could be that we use our own flexible pot, or we call it a disaster fund pot, which is brilliant flexible funding stream that enables us to respond to the many under the radar disasters that happen throughout the year through our set of disaster preparedness partners who are based in disaster prone countries around the world. And that really enables targeted, effective, quick responses to the many disasters that happen. And sometimes we also recognise that it might be better to just monitor the situation and not rush into a decision. And actually, interestingly, that's what happened with our decision with Venezuela, because the earthquakes happened on the Wednesday evening Venezuelan time. So we woke up to the news on the Thursday. And we brought together the teams really quickly within the organisation. But we recognised that, the headlines were there and it looked severe. But when we met, I think it was like 10 a.m. in the morning, and we were assessing the information that we had from humanitarian networks, from the information streams that we have, and we were trying to assess just how bad the scale was. But in all honesty, at that point, we didn't have the credible information, because actually what happened was that the internet and the comms in Venezuela was affected and they came down. That information flow wasn't coming through at that stage. So what we decided to do at that point was to monitor and to gather more information. And so we spent the next couple of hours frantically trying to, reach our humanitarian networks, to try and locate possible partners. And we, from our contacts and from various assessments that we then were able to make, it became clear that the earthquakes really did cause major casualties, that there was widespread damage and disruption, and that it was clear from the international community that they had identified that millions of people were affected or at risk. And importantly, also in that time, we had a viable route to respond, because we had made contact with our two partners, Cadena, an organisation that we've worked with previously in Colombia and in the Philippines, who we knew had a local office in Venezuela. And we were also able to reach the Jewish Community Centre in Caracas as well. And so through those conversations, we were also able to identify and understand a bit more about the need, the scale, and start building a partnership and a potential response with them as well. So I think it was by lunchtime, really, and then we had decided to launch an appeal, which I think is a pretty rapid decision making within the organisation. And I think that speed was, just to kind of reiterate, I suppose, the speed of that decision was made possible because we did have that credible information on the scale of the impact of the earthquakes. We saw that there was large-scale humanitarian need. We had the potential operating partners at that point, and we also had a sense that the Jewish community would support us if we were to appeal.
So, Stacey, I just want to ask quickly before we move to James, how we respond in Venezuela without taking our eyes off of all of the other work that we're doing. I know James's schedule. James had just gotten back from Bangladesh right after he had gone to Mozambique, right after he had gone to, I think, Eastern Ethiopia. One new crisis doesn't replace an old crisis. And so how do we provide that balance to make sure that giving focus on a place where there's an urgent need doesn't take our eyes off the crisis that exists somewhere else?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And the honest answer is that it's not easy. We're a small team. As you just mentioned, James is a regular traveller. So we have limited capacity, and every new emergency and disaster creates real pressure with the team. It does. We have to reprioritise, we make decisions quickly, but we also have to balance and be able to carry several responses at the same time. That is the nature of a humanitarian organisation, and an ambitious one like us as well. We can't say that because we're already responding in Ukraine or Mozambique that we're unable to act when another serious crisis happens. We have to build enough flexibility into our funding, our team capacity, our partnerships, our ways of working to respond to disasters while continuing to manage existing commitments. As you mentioned, James was literally on a flight back from Bangladesh when we came together as a team to decide what our response should be. He was there, he was meeting our brilliant partner in Bangladesh, who was responding to flooding and fire in Dhaka and supporting the Rohingya community to strengthen their camp infrastructure to improve safety and security around the camp. So, we just had this really intense trip. So I decided, you could have a couple of hours off, and then we came straight back into this response and went out to Venezuela a couple of weeks later. But, we don't, as I hope I can explain, we don't just rush in. We do really think carefully about how we can add value, how large our response should be, and really how we can balance everything. And I suppose just to kind of highlight again the principle that just because there is a new crisis, it doesn't make existing ones less important. And we have a responsibility to manage both responsibly and as effectively as we possibly can. And maybe just to highlight, that is huge thanks to our donors and supporters, everybody on this call that enables us to do this and who responds to the appeals with the same compassion and care that we have. So I did just want to say thank you to everybody for joining, but also for supporting this appeal.
Here. And Stacey, with that context in mind, let's turn now to Venezuela and what James is seeing, what communities need, and how we determine where our work can make the greatest difference. So Stacey, I'm going to turn the conversation over to you and James. I'm going to take myself off the screen and hope to share some pictures too. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, David. So James, why don't we kick off the conversation with just a question about telling us, where have you been, what have you seen?
Hello, Stacey. Thank you very much for the introductions. So greetings, everyone from Caracas. It's been a very intense couple of days. One way that might help frame what we've seen is green, amber, and red. So where the hotel I'm sitting in currently is in a green area, which was not an area that was significantly affected by shaking. If I look out the window, I'm unable to see large cracks in buildings or any rubble. But I will progress chronologically through what I have seen in the order of the trip. The first area that I would consider amber, which was not the very, very heart epicenter, but was one of the areas that was affected by shaking, was a district of Caracas called San Bernardino, which happens to be one of the areas where a large number of the Jewish community lives in Caracas. And as you move through that district, you will see many, many dozens, if not hundreds of buildings with very large cracks. It does vary from just jagged etches into the concrete, all the way from whole balconies kind of falling through, and you can see straight into the apartments. A variety of structural cracks, so buildings that become uninhabitable, and surface cracks, so buildings that are habitable, but the inside of the building, the inside of the accommodation will have the walls, kind of all the plaster falls down, the ceiling falls down, a lot of the tiling, so they're uninhabitable. You do have in San Bernardino low digit numbers of totally collapsed buildings. I might have seen a few just empty lots that people would tell me this was one of the buildings that sadly fell, and around about 30 people were killed in this building. And there were several of such incidents, including a few that had not yet been cleared. So San Bernardino, it was impacted quite severely. But as we get closer to the epicenter, there are two other communities that our other partners are responding to. The first location that we went to, we just so happened to run into the president of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez. So we were unable to enter the depth of the community because it was swarmed with large numbers of military and police. But we did arrive at the edge of the community, which was essentially a few thousand people living in a car park, where their low-rise accommodation, probably 3 to 4 stories, stood fairly empty, quite shell-like looking. So the community, if the accommodation was able to be lived in, they were very scared to return, or it was uninhabitable. So those communities were all in this car park facility, living in tents completely. And the third and final community that we're responding to in the amber zone also had a similar experience. Very, very low rise buildings. This was even lower, probably maximum 1 or 2 stories. And a very large percentage, I couldn't put exactly, but very high tens of percent, completely destroy buildings. And again, large numbers of people living in tents, doing the best they can to cope with a very mixed amount of response. But the key epicenter is what I will consider the red zone, which is an area that has been very severely affected. It's hard to say exactly how many, but clearly many dozens, potentially even hundreds of towers like the one that you're seeing on the screen now will have completely collapsed. And you have various scenes of humanitarian response. You might have emergency medical teams, diggers, large machinery, individuals climbing over the rubble looking for family members, or professionals with PPE, sorting through various issues. You have long lines of people queuing for food. So the red zone is the epicenter and a particularly intense area of impact. But there are also many tens of thousands of people living just on the edge of that area that were also very severely affected.
And I suppose you paint a very vivid picture about the destruction, and we can see the photos of that. But are you kind of, your sense of the reality of it being kind of bigger than you had anticipated? I mean, we know official stats are something like 4,700 people have been killed, over 17,000 injured, but your sense of feeling about the kind of the huge area that's been affected, and just how it feels being there.
I would definitely open by saying it was much larger than I had anticipated, and it was much more severe than I had anticipated. It also impacted a fairly modern urban settlement. It wasn't a rural area with low population density. As you can see on screen, this would have been surrounded on left and right by similar tall apartment buildings, and this is the sole standing building that remains in this area, but it would have been flanked all the way along for potentially miles. So it was a modern city. It was a modern city with modern roads and modern infrastructure, and it had modern urban density. And you have 3 groups discussing severity. So the first is government, and they are producing the figures that you've mentioned. So about 4,700 people killed, about 17,000 injured, and about 40,000 missing. You have the United Nations, the UN, that are claiming similar figures, but maybe 50,000 people missing. And then you have the NGOs, local NGOs specifically, and they're claiming that up to 100,000 people are missing. And noting that it's now the 15th of July and the earthquake was on the 24th of June, I think the sad reality is that if a person hasn't been found after that much time, lack of water, lack of food, it's probable that they are no longer with us. So one would assume that a very large percentage of missing, unfortunately, will mean dead. Um, it isn't possible to say which group's statistics are correct, but the one thing that is absolutely clear to me it is many thousands, tens of thousands of people. So it's large and significantly larger than I had anticipated.
And as you say, it's all still unfolding. And we know that even in the 3 weeks, there's been over 1,000 aftershocks or something like that. So, and our role, we have to focus on the living and helping people to live in these really tough moments and think about the recovery. But how are people coping with, their loss, with these continued aftershocks, with the kind of thinking about what's next? And maybe also, I know that you visited the Jewish community. Can you give us a sense about how the Jewish community are also kind of bringing people together through that?
Yeah, thank you for reminding me about the Jewish community. And I mentioned to Stacey to you previously that I haven't felt so proud to be Jewish to some extent since I've been here. It is amazing what the Jewish community can do in all over the world. The way the community came together was so moving. They have a very large center that called the Hebracha that was built over 60, 70-year period. And I would describe it to you as a small university campus. That's kind of what it feels like inside this community center. It was built for 40,000. You now have about 3,000 to 4,000 Jews left. Many have emigrated. And when the earthquake hit, that facility flung open its doors to Jewish and non-Jewish people to give them a place to be during the height of the fear, during the height of the crisis. And it was amazing that people have been there for each other, sleeping there for multiple days and nights. And that sense of community has pulled many people through, and it still does. Outside the community, people are resilient all over the world. Humans are resilient, but I would be lying if I said it wasn't very difficult for them. I mean, this house, the pink one you see on screen, was in one of the amber zones, and it is a vulnerable community before the earthquake. And you can see they've lost almost everything. And no, in Venezuela, there isn't insurance, there's no home insurance, there is no one to really help you. So if this happens to you, more or less you're on your own to fix it. And it's really hard. And people do express this to us. One woman who had a son who was very disabled was asking if she can come back to London with me because they can't get the wheelchair for her son, they can't get their medicine, and she was on the verge of tears. So people are resilient and strong, but it's very hard for many of them. But much of the community has rallied, and I think what the Jewish community have done has been truly beautiful.
That is good to hear, I suppose, but recognise that there's many who aren't accessing that support. And I wonder, is there any one person or family that has stayed with you?
I will give a personal and impersonal story. One of the images that is definitely staying with me is in the red zone. The buildings were often tower blocks, and they collapsed. I was told that the earthquake was a strange earthquake, and what people meant by that was the first one had a wave motion like this, and then the second one had a kind of back and forth motion like that. And the combination of the two just caused the buildings to absolutely collapse en masse. And what people have done is they've spray painted on the rubble, the floors. You can see them stacked up like pancakes. Piso 1, Piso 2, floor 3, floor 4, floor 5, all the way up, so that they can find where in the building their likely loved ones are. And you'll see people not wearing anything you should be when working in such a hazardous construction site. So should if you're working professionally, helmet, goggles, high vis, boots, the whole kind of PPE kit, gloves. Whereas you have people wearing whatever they have on them, digging through rubble with their bare hands, looking for their family. So it is deeply sad to see. So that's an impersonal story that to some extent is staying with me. But a personal story that really moved me was one of the members of the Jewish community. She had a mother with dementia. She moved back to the US from the US to Venezuela about 5 years ago after getting divorced. And I mentioned her mother has dementia, and she has two small children, one who has autism. The daughter's about 13 with autism, the son's about 10. And the reason her story stayed with me is because my grandmother on my mother's side had dementia. I saw how hard it was for my mum, and my sister has two young children, and I see how hard it is for her. And her home was in the amber zone. And although the building remained, they're saying, structurally sound, a huge amount of the inside of the building kind of collapsed into her home. So a lot of extra cost. And because of the medical costs of her mother and the special school for her daughter, she doesn't have the extra capacity financially to pay for all that needs to be done. And I just thought she was such a superhero. The ability to keep going with a mother who was so vulnerable, with children who were vulnerable. And it stayed with me. She was on the verge of tears telling me the story, but she still found the strength to smile and get up and go to work and thank me for coming. And yeah, it was quite moving and beautiful and testament to her strength.
Thanks for talking us through that, James. And I think, it resonates. But we know that women are in particularly, they are particularly affected when it comes to humanitarian disasters, and the many caring responsibilities that they have. The impact is doublefold often on women. So let's then come to what are we doing? What are we doing to support this particular woman or others like her? How do we aim to identify the gaps? The way that World Wish Relief works, we want to reach those that aren't being served by others, the more marginalized or the hardest to reach. Can you tell us, in this response, how are we doing that? Who do you think we should be targeting, are targeting, and what are their most urgent needs right now?
If I again use the color coding so it's easy for people to understand, the red zone, the very heart of the disaster, is an area that is, I'm not saying everyone, but relatively well covered between a mix of government response and United Nations agency responses. So they have provided large numbers of formal shelters that have most of the amenities that you would need to live in dignity. Some people have chosen not to go to those shelters and remain searching for family, but they are also being served by other members of the community. So, but the amber zones have been equally impacted with huge amounts of home destruction, but remain deeply underserved because a lot of the surge of humanitarian assistance has gone to that epicenter area. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think the needs in that area were so high as to require the volume of assistance from the government and the UN agencies. But the needs of the people, the tens of thousands of people in the amber zones, still remains. And that is a gap where World Jewish Relief and our partners have added demonstrable value. So we first worked with the JCC in a rapid fund disbursement to support them within the first 72 hours with providing beds for the families who were sleeping in the community kind of area and food for hundreds of families. That was just the most rapid, the most urgent needs for them at the time. And the needs are constantly shifting. But a chronic need that has remained within the Jewish community is home repair. So there were dozens and hundreds of people whose homes were a mix of completely destroyed or damaged severely. So our next round of programming for JCC is working with specific families to really repair their homes so that they are able to live with dignity and move back where they want to be. Beyond the Jewish community, we have been working with Cadena, who I can discuss later in the discussion, but who I just think are fantastic. This is not the first time we've worked with them, and I'm always impressed by their professionalism and dedication. So really, really enjoy working with Cadena. And with them, we're reaching over 4,000 people who are not members of the Jewish community with the first round of rapid response assistance. And the needs across this humanitarian emergency tend to be shelter is definitely number one. But then there's a lot of wash needs, and psychosocial seems to be something, food as well. But food is something that a lot of other international organizations seem to be providing en masse, so it's not a gap per se. And also when it comes to shelter, things like tents have been provided, so that's not a gap. But there's a lot of other habitable non-food items that people need to live with dignity. So one of the main things that Cadena have been helping with is the installation of water infrastructure and water filters. We've been hearing reports of outbreaks of waterborne diseases, things like cholera, because people before would have got water from their home, like I assume many of the listeners on this call may do. But if your home has collapsed or gone, then the question is, where do you get water from? And if tens of thousands of people have the same question at the same time, there often is an issue with access to clean water. And when you drink dirty water, then the risks of diseases have been climbing. So Cadena have been working to install water drums, fill them with water, so water trucking, and the installation of water filters so that many thousands of people have access to reliable and safe clean water over the medium to long term. They've also been providing household hygiene kits because, again, if you've lost everything, you don't have access to anything for basic hygiene and dignity. They've also been providing solar lamps, which is a shelter and protection-based assistance. So it's very useful across multiple humanitarian contexts to have a reliable source of light where if everything is destroyed, you don't have. So it provides basic dignity inside the shelter. But light spaces are also safer spaces, and dark spaces tend to be more unsafe. So by providing communities with more access to light, it also helps with reducing issues and increasing protection. And the last, support for children, and children often get, I mean, all people do, but children especially are very vulnerable to the trauma of such a large-scale disaster. So that has been the first round of response, and we are working with both partners to plan the second round of response, scaling up further because the needs do still remain.
And maybe can you talk to us about how those needs might be shifting, either as we look ahead to the next month or two, but then potentially afterwards, because, we always have this discussion internally, kind of how do we balance the relief to recovery? Where should we focus our efforts? Why is it so important to focus so much on relief, but how can we not forget about recovery as well? And what are we thinking in terms of kind of the next couple of months in our response? And are we thinking even beyond that at this stage?
It's a very excellent and important question. And at this point, I think we're likely to see an extended blend between emergency and recovery. So a lot of, I want to say reconstruction, but the very, very beginning of reconstruction is beginning. So in a lot of the rubble affected areas in the red zone, you will have large mechanical diggers beginning to clear the rubble and make way for the reconstruction. But that will be weeks and months out. Similarly, in the amber affected areas, people themselves are also beginning to clear the rubble. So people want to begin to move away from the emergency, and they want to begin to move towards recovery. But emergency needs are likely to remain for a few reasons. One would be the needs were just so high on the outset that it will take quite a long time for that emergency to really be over. And maybe let's not forget that Venezuela was a vulnerable location before the emergency. So state resources aren't infinite. So as the state runs out of resources for various factors of the response, needs might respike. And similarly, a lot of UN agencies and INGOs funding might follow similar trajectories. They may have a large amount of funding at the beginning, and it begins to taper off as the months go by, but the needs will remain. So I think a blended mix of recovery and emergency are likely to stay. I think wash and shelter are going to be two very, very critical factors. So access to reliable, safe water and its various components, as well as personal wash and hygiene to prevent the spread of diseases and live within dignity, is something that really intersects emergency response, because you need wash today to survive, but it also leads very naturally into recovery. And similarly, shelter-based needs. So people might have received their tents, they might now have received some of the NFIs they need, non-food items they need, but that always shifts. So for example, it's the rainy season now. So it was thunderstorms when I arrived in Venezuela. So people are living in tents, and then you have the rain gushing into your tent. And if your mattress is on the floor, which it is, then everything becomes really wet. So people need some way of raising their mattresses up. So these emergency needs will remain for several months. But the main recovery activity, I think through both the GCC and Cadena that we are discussing with them, is shelter repair. how can we help communities to repair their lives, repair their shelters so that they can move back to their homes and continue living with dignity.
Yeah, absolutely. Essential part of the kind of short-term recovery process. And I guess, we also talk about the importance of cash as well as delivery of non-food items. And I wonder kind of like your sense of, is it possible to provide cash as well as give people the goods and the food that they need?
There is a debate in the humanitarian sector at large about cash, and generally the thinking is that cash is a better form of assistance in many conditions, but not all. As long as markets are functional, so people can actually spend the money, what cash enables is dignity. So you can choose the type of material you like, the color that you like, so that you actually get to live in a space that you feel comfortable with. And Cadena and ourselves are thinking of cash. Now, there are some unique political complications within Venezuela about the use of cash. However, the sector at large, mostly led by negotiations at the United Nations level, are thinking to get the sign-off, essentially, on the use of cash just across the humanitarian sector within Venezuela. It's looking good. I don't want to make any promises, but it's looking possible. If that does convert and agencies are able to utilize cash, Cadena and ourselves are very much keen and open where appropriate to using a cash-based assistance to support communities in reconstructing their homes.
Thanks, that's really clear. And we often as an organisation try and prioritise cash, don't we, wherever possible, because cash is best, but it is not always possible. So we have to balance the reality with the aim of best practice. And maybe just one last question then, in terms of, after everything that you've seen and heard during the visit so far, what's the one thing you most want those joining us today to understand about the situation in Venezuela right now?
I think the first thing is it is extremely severe. It is much more severe a crisis than I had anticipated, and traveling into the country. And that means that the needs will remain for a fairly long time. And WJR and our supporters can make an amazing difference in the lives of the earthquake affected people. And we need the support of our wonderful community in order to do so.
Thank you, Stacey and James, and please do stay on because we have questions that you're going to answer much better than I am. I want to encourage folks to continue putting questions into the Q&A. The first one, I think this is really just an answer to reiterate, but what is World Jewish Relief actually able to give people at this point in material terms? What have we been able to put into people's hands, James?
We've been able to put into people's hands, firstly, beds and food through our partners with the JCC. That was in the first days of the response. That was the most urgent. I need this today. And so supporting the JCC with a grant to help them buy those beds locally and procure that food locally for the hundreds of families that were in the JCC was the most rapid and urgent form of assistance. The next type of assistance that we have put not necessarily in the hands of a single person, is the water infrastructure. So many of these people, thousands of people living in car parks outside damaged and destroyed homes, don't have access to reliable and clean water. So with Cadena, we've installed water infrastructure and water filters so that people can begin to ensure that they have access to daily, reliable, clean, safe drinking water for themselves, their children, their families, as well as hygiene kits to help with household dignity, solar lamps to help with lighting, which is a shelter-based need, but also helps create safe spaces for the very, very vulnerable communities living on the street. And finally, psychosocial support for children who have been living a very, very challenging time during and since the earthquake has kicked off. And that's just our phase one. We have a huge amount more that we're planning with both partners, including more shelter recovery, more shelter rehabilitation, potentially cash, as Stacey was speaking, various forms of improved water infrastructure. So what we've done and what we have do is something that has been inspiring to see, and I hope we can do a lot more.
So, James, here's a great question. World Jewish Relief and our partners are not the only ones, clearly, who are responding to the earthquake. There are folks coming from around the world to respond. How do we ensure that the work that we're doing is additive, that we're not tripping over the feet of others? How do we find our place there?
This is essentially the standard operating model of the humanitarian sector. So you have various coordination bodies, both United Nations, government, and NGO, and essentially we plug into that coordination mechanism, both as ourselves and our local partners. And by plugging into that model, we can see who's doing what, where, and what isn't being done. And doing that helped us identify that the red zone was more or less covered by government and UN agencies. But the many tens of thousands of people living just outside in the amber zone, whose homes were also completely destroyed, who have also lost everything, remained underserved. And that enabled us to actually pivot and say, okay, if this area is covered with shelter and food, then it's a duplication of assistance and it doesn't add value to them or the people who yet have not received assistance. And so therefore our partners are pivoted. And we remain flexible, we remain agile. I mean, tomorrow, maybe those communities have received assistance and therefore we need to relocate to another community who needs our aid. But essentially the answer is you need to plug into the coordination mechanism that the humanitarian sector has in most large-scale sudden onset disasters and remain flexible and agile.
So, James, Stacey, you've both described well the model of World Jewish Relief working through local partners. We don't go in there to do all of the implementation ourselves, but to work side by side with local partners. You've talked about the two that we have in Venezuela now. I assume there's a potential that may grow. World Jewish Relief's covenant with those who provide us support is to thoughtfully, lovingly, impactfully, transparently be the stewards of their generosity. And so how do we go through the process of vetting our partners to make sure that our supporters' generosity is used in the most impactful, transparent, responsible way?
I think I'll take this question, David. So yeah, I mean, we really do take our role seriously in terms of being very accountable for the funds that our supporters are giving us. And we want to make sure as an organisation that we are not wasteful, that we're supporting the right organisation in the right way. And we have to do that in various ways. And it starts with checking out, well, who are the organisations that we're aiming to work with? And as you say, we work internationally with local partners around the world. And local partners really are the best way to have an impact because they are from their communities, they understand the need, the complexities of working, they can identify who are the people that need the support. And it's far better that they lead that response and we accompany them and we support them than we go in and set up our own offices and think that we know best. And our role really is to add value to the funds that we're given. We don't just want to pass on the funds. We are there to support the design, the implementation, the monitoring of all of the programs that we do, and to be that critical friend. So we're incredibly supportive of our partners. We're really agile, as James was saying, and flexible. But we also ask the tough questions and we look for ways that we can improve the program implementation. What are we learning from each and every program, and how can we therefore iterate and improve the next cycle? But I think importantly, it starts with the due diligence, right? That's the question that you're asking. It starts with like, how do we know we're working with appropriate organisations? And we have a really strong due diligence process in place, and that means that we are looking at the core kind of organisational details, that we're making sure that we've got the registration certificate, that we know what policies are in place, that we know who is on the board and who's in their leadership positions, that we can check, do background checks on them, and that they can reassure us that they've got the appropriate policies and practices in place, whether that's in terms of financial management, whether that's in terms of safeguarding, to ensure that they can also implement the programmes appropriately and accountably, and are also able to report back on the use of that money as well.
Great. And James, do you want to talk about any unique challenges that you've found working in Venezuela, whether it is political challenges, climate challenges? Maybe there are things you can't talk about, but is it a uniquely challenging environment to work in right now?
I mean, there are political challenges. The government is much more visible and present than I potentially had expected. There are large numbers just validating who people are, going backwards and forwards. So that is definitely interesting. I think the fundamental challenge is just the scale. Scale in a crisis presents a challenge unto itself. So whereas in other emergencies, the challenge might be the distance to the affected area, or how difficult it is to get to the affected area, or various other things. In this location, it's under an hour. The roads are well paved. It's relatively easy to get there. As long as you don't get blocked for security or political reasons, you can access relatively easily. But just the volume of need by itself is a challenge, and therefore the knock-on impacts to the vulnerability of the community. There are also quite a large number of different humanitarian actors within operating in Venezuela for this crisis, which is both positive because it means that a large amount of groups are being supported through various actors, but it's challenging because coordination between many hundreds is challenging. But there are mechanisms around that, as alluded to in the question from the previous panelist.
So there's just two more questions. One is more lighthearted. One gets to the heart of the matter. I will start with the lighthearted one. Actually, we just had another one added, but I'll give the lighthearted one right now anyway, which is James watching football tonight from Caracas?
I will be. I actually will be watching it with all of our partners. So we're all getting together and we're watching the football together. And Cosmo, who is the amazing comms officer from World Jewish Relief, has arrived recently. So himself and myself will be the only England supporters in a nation full of Argentina fans, I assume.
So two more questions. To both of you, in your view, what is the single most important message that you'd like the public to take away from today or tonight's discussion?
I think for me, clearly with James being there, we can understand just the scale of need that there is. And I think we are doing all that we can with the money that we raise to have an impact and to reach those areas, as James was saying, that others are not reaching. But clearly the scale of need is enormous, and we're so grateful for all of the support. And the more that we can raise, the more that we can do. That's my one message.
Which brings us to the $100,000 or multi-$100,000 or pound question. And I know that, as we have continued to respond and as we have seen the evolving need, our intent, our plans, our strategies for response, both emergency response in short and long-term strategies, continue to grow. And so what is the goal? What is the opportunity that we're providing to those who are part of our World Jewish Relief community who would like to participate in this process? I'll be very blunt. What kind of budget are we looking to raise so that we can fully realize our vision for making impact in Venezuela?
We started with one budget and then we extend it. And I think what we're seeing is that we could have real impact. And we have, at the moment, we have a target of around £500,000 for the appeal, which I believe is something around $670,000 US. But the appeal is very much live. and it's active. And we, as you said, our response is evolving as we understand the needs, and we can do so much to respond to those needs. And we can really, as I was saying, like we can make a really targeted impact with partners that we have. So we're forever grateful for every penny that we can raise for this emergency. Yeah, we will report back on the impact that we're having. And we just think that we have a real role to play here, and we can really add value to the response efforts.
And Stacey and James, I want to be clear how much gratitude we have for both of you, Stacey, for your leadership, and James for your expertise in the work that you're doing on the ground. Our gratitude for our partners at the JCC and Cadena, and our gratitude for all of those in the World Jewish Relief community who helped make this response possible. And one thing that I want to emphasize, and we have a slide up on the screen, if you have a vision for making impact with us in Venezuela, how you can do that either from the UK or from the US. One of the things that I want to emphasize is putting together a budget for £500,000 or $670,000 doesn't just take one large supporter to make that happen. I was talking a lot around Passover about this scene in the movie The Ten Commandments when Moses is leading the people out of the land of Egypt. And it's not Moses carrying the entire country and all its possessions on his back like he's Atlas. It's one person carrying a basket and one person pulling a cart and someone else carrying a baby, that it really does take a nation to move a nation, and that if all of us who are moved to make a difference in whatever way that we are able to, in whatever way that we are moved to, that it will enable us to change and save lives for the people in Venezuela who are in such a desperate situation for our help and support right now. And finally, to just provide the reminder that our work in Venezuela is one of 20 or so different countries that we're working in at any point. We didn't know that we would be working in Venezuela 2 months ago, and we don't know where we'll be working 2 months from now. And your support is what enables us to respond quickly and effectively. And it's our covenant to be the responsible and thoughtful and loving stewards of your generosity. And so we want to thank you for making that happen. Thank you for all of us for joining us tonight. And I wish all of you a good afternoon, a good evening, and leave you with the deepest gratitude. Thank you, James. Thank you, Stacey. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, David.
Gracias.